The Fourth Amendment is a very adaptable provision of the Constitution because its basic understanding of protection of privacy can be applied in many different contexts. And so often the courts are called on to do that. But even more importantly, law enforcement officers have to decide on the street, on the spot, how much privacy they need to protect versus how much they can use their investigative powers to gather information that's relevant for an investigation.
The Fourth Amendment, in the main, endeavors to balance two central values. First is public safety. The second is individual liberty. And the way in which this balance is struck largely depends on what's going on in the world. That's a very realist, practical way to understand it. Let's take the Patriot Act, for example. When the Patriot Act was passed, the devastation and destruction from 9/11 was so raw that people were very much inclined to give up some personal liberties in order to feel safe. Now, much of my scholarship and me personally, I'm very much a civil libertarian. I was on Capitol Hill on 9/11. My eldest son was 6 months old. We were in one of the Capitol buildings. He was about to take pictures with the First Lady, Laura Bush, who was on the Hill for a cabinet meeting, or on the Hill actually to speak before a committee. And all of a sudden, someone in the office said, "Get out, everybody get out." So people start running from the office. I had my 6-month-old in my arms running out of the building. And overhead, I don't know what's going on. We get outside, overhead, fighter jets are zooming by. And I think, oh God, my child's gonna die. At that point, you don't care about yourself. So even for an old civil libertarian like myself, if I had to vote that day, I would say no civil liberties, no individual rights, right? Let's make sure that we are safe. And that pretty much was the mood of the country at that time. So the Patriot Act was passed with a show of bipartisanship we hadn't seen before and hadn't seen since. Everybody was on board. Now, when fast forward 15 years, when the Patriot Act was up for another reauthorization, then the entire major portions of the act expired because there no longer was bipartisan support. There were serious objections to the bill, and many argue that the tilt toward public safety had too undermined the liberty interests.
Our interpretation of the Fourth Amendment has varied as we interpret the concept of privacy. Is it primarily something that's a political concern? Is it primarily something that's a matter of our personal autonomy? Is it something that can be waived if we share information with even one other person? Or is it something that's still preserved? All of those are competing questions within this general concept of privacy. And depending on how we answer it at any given moment, things can change radically, as they have ever since the September 11th attacks.
The new technologies, including smartphones and any various and sundry number of smart devices and electronic media, has complicated Fourth Amendment analysis beyond belief. So what does one do with all of this information? Now, a predicate of the Fourth Amendment is that the Fourth Amendment protects information that people reasonably believe is private. Query whether even home is, people have a reasonable expectation of privacy if they're recording everything they do at home and recording what meals they're eating and whatever other things people do on these various electronic media. So the question is, how private is that stuff? Do people have a reasonable expectation of privacy in these devices? So for a telephone, yes. What about in the numbers you dial, right? Well, perhaps you don't sort of share the numbers you dial with the public, but you do share it with your carrier. You do share it with the phone company. Presumably, they know what numbers are being dialed. You share it with the person you're calling. How private is it? And these are the somewhat complicated questions. To some, they may think mind-numbing, but complicated questions that the Supreme Court is wrestling with. What's the scope of privacy with these electronic media? If someone is arrested, there is a concept called search incident to arrest. So you arrest someone, you now have the right, because you've arrested them as a function of probable cause, they have reduced liberty interest. You can now do a search of them, not just a pat-down frisk, a full-on search. You do a search of those individuals, you pull out, let's say you pull out a cell phone, right? Can you then search the cell phone, right? If you pulled out a diary, could you open it up and look at it? If that answer is yes, why can't you press a button on a cell phone and see what was the last number called or what was the last text? This is a prime example of the difficulty of a constitution written for one generation and technology that's being employed by another generation.